times now. He's the head of Edgeworth Consulting. So our next speaker is Lou Burkholz, who has come to the trauma conference quite a few times now. He's the head of Edgeworth Consulting, and he has worked all over the world in Gaza and South America and all over the place, basically. And a very central theme of this conference we've had is that trauma is about losing touch with people, getting out of sync with people, losing your capacity to play. And to my mind, Lou's interventions of really applying what we have learned about trauma to help people to get in sync with each other, in touch with each other, is a critical part of helping people to overcome trauma, and particularly in the age of COVID, when people are locked down and people are paralyzed and people are frightened about what the future will bring. I think Lou's capacity to help us to play and to feel and to get in sync with each other is a critical part of the work that we all need to learn. So I'm delighted that Lou is joining us again this year.
Bessel, thank you for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be presenting. I want to start by giving a huge shout out to everyone in the past few months who has moved mountains to adapt and truly invent virtual curriculum and programming for kids. Flipped, twisted, and contorted your existing programming to provide what is needed most right now, regardless of what you're providing before the pandemic. Been reaching out to parents and caregivers to try to be supportive of them while they're struggling with work at home, school at home, life at home. Driven or walked streets, knocked on doors, searched communities to try to track down your kids to make sure they're okay, or shown up at someone's door to sing, dance, cheer, teach math, or has responded on text or picked up the phone to connect with one of your kids at any hour of the day or night. I'm an out-of-school person by experience and training. This has been the vast majority of the work that we've done at Edgework in the trauma space for the past 20 years. The lens that we're going to use today is this out-of-school lens. So think of it as a Boys and Girls Club, a YMCA, a day or residential camp, a tutoring program, a sport or recreation program, something in the arts, anything where we're working with children in that out-of-school context. I'm presenting based from two angles. One is our own study of trauma and partnering that we've been able to do with experts in the field, coming from the pure research and academic side and the clinical side. And a lot of work that we've been able to do working with grassroots organizations around the world, attempting to do something addressing trauma, resilience, or mental health in a community context. With the time we have, I want to share with you how we have thought about doing trauma-informed program design for grassroots organizations. I'm going to split the time between some frameworks and principles that we use generally, and then spotlight a piece of what we do that hopefully is particularly relevant in our current pandemic reality. We're thinking about this community context as being situations where definitive clinical care is not an option, at least not for everyone. So this means likely no formal evaluation of individual participants. You have their context, and you know about who you're serving. You have the stories that you learn about your participants over time, and obviously you have behavior that you observe in your program. And from those pieces of data, you triangulate that we need something that has that trauma-informed lens to it. Over the past 20 years, we've had the privilege and the pleasure of working with organizations like the Boys and Girls Club of Canada, Street Soccer USA, the Newtown Parks and Rec Department, Free to Run Afghanistan, the Serious Fund Network, the Hole in the Wall Gang Camps, Worldwide Orphans Foundation, Mercy Corps, and Care International in Gaza. And that's where I want to start. I think, like many others, I've been searching for an event or an experience in my life to compare the COVID-19 pandemic to. And we do this because it helps us put the experience in some kind of meaningful and comparative context. The term unprecedented has been used many times in the past few months. And on many levels, it's true. Not in recent history has anything like this happened so profoundly and so broadly around the world. And being able to put terrible events in perspective and make them relative is one of the most meaningful tools we have as humans to make sense of tragedy, of loss, to grieve, to mourn, to reconcile, to forgive, and to heal. It's also a root of resilience. When we can tell ourselves that we've been through this or worse before, it helps us find a kind of authorship to the experience that can increase our efficacy and our agency. When we can find a place and people in the world that have survived this or worse, we can tell ourselves that maybe we will make it through as well. Comparing and contrasting experiences to make sense of one's current hardship is a buffer against hopelessness and giving up. It can help create a kind of harmony in one's brain in an otherwise disjointed and dysregulated situation. I've been searching for analogs to the COVID-19 pandemic for the above reasons. And for me, that analog that I'm turning to is Gaza. Between 2009 and 2013, I was working in and out of Gaza with Care International and Mercy Corps, primarily on a project called Eye to the Future. E2F was the acronym for it, was a after-school program for 9 to 13-year-olds in 8 communities around Gaza. The focus of the project was on mental health promotion and violence reduction. This was not a peace program between Palestinians and Israelis. This was a program specifically for Gazan children, to try to mitigate the widespread symptoms that they were presenting with, from internalizing to behavioral. I traveled to Gaza roughly 6 times over those 4 years, each trip 2 to 4 weeks, and I had the privilege of working with 160 mentors, 18 to 30-year-olds who were staffing the program in these 8 communities. So why Gaza? During the time that I was there were a number of factors that made for the context and the situation that we were working in. And as I compare those to what we're going through now, there were so many that, though it's not a pandemic situation historically there, so many of them overlap with, I think, what people are experiencing now. This intensive, pervasive, ongoing, and unpredictable dynamic and stress and sort of source of a lot of the fear that people have. Restrictions on movement, social isolation, food uncertainty and disruptions to the supply chain, economic hardships, children in and out of schools for extended periods of time. In Gaza, there were so many schools that were damaged over the years that kids kind of permanently were either attending a half day in the morning or a half day in the afternoon. And everyone there knew somebody who'd been directly affected by the situation. And I think that's beginning to happen for a lot of people here as well. Having spent a significant amount of time there, I got to see firsthand what coping with chronic, unpredictable, and pervasive stressors look like. I was also able to leave, come back, and see people again several months later, several years later. And as an analog, it's really helped me make sense of my pandemic experience. I can't say that I'm less anxious, but I think the cognitive side of my brain can process things a little bit more, having a reference point. But more importantly, from the program design side, it's had a huge impact on how myself, but also we as Edgework, think about making a strong, trauma-informed program for children and youth. In Gaza, we utilized a heavy set of evaluation tools. We consulted with experts. We were able to partner with Wendy DeAndrea and the New School for some of that work, and we achieved some pretty solid results. But what it did more than anything else for me was challenge me to bridge research to practice and to really work in context. And that's the premise of how everything we think about now in terms of trauma-informed program design. So I'm not talking about ideal circumstances where you can control all the variables, from assessing your attendees to managing attendance to budgets to staff training and titrating for that perfect dose. I'm coming at this from truly imperfect solutions to complex realities. And yet it's my strong belief that you can still make a difference in almost every circumstance. To do this well, you have to have a practical pathway for healing, stripped down to program approach, structure, activities, and even language that's accessible to staff, parents and caregivers, and even to kids. And that really does work in the field. So we think about a pathway to healing as something that follows how we tend to do our healing work in our day-to-day lives for ourselves. We aren't necessarily erasing all of the trauma that someone experiences. We aren't fixing all the broken parts. A big win for most people is that they end up in a better place. And not just one that an expert says for them is better, but that they actually for themselves feel they're doing okay. And we gauge that at least by 3 criteria at a minimum. A more consistent, positive story of self, that feeling of feeling normal more often than not, and those health-seeking choices intact, being able to make fairly consistent health-seeking choices. So working down the steps of the pyramid to get there, each participant needs to spend some time focusing on, and the program needs to orient around what we think of simply as daily functioning. To feel in a better place is to string together a number of better days. So having a day that works, and then 2 days that work, and then maybe 3, maybe one day that doesn't, but the 5th one does. A week in a row where you start to feel that your day-to-day things are pretty good. That's the precursor to that better place. And that means that what's happening is your ability to handle bad stress tends to get better. And within that, you're able to react relatively accordingly to the level of pressure or stressor you're experiencing. If it's something small, your reactions can kind of align around that. If it actually is a larger stressor with more disruption, you have that kind of reaction as well. The big struggle you're facing tends to get just a little bit easier to manage. And that's on the thought side, but also on the behavior side. That might be sleep. It might be how you manage your anger. It might be your ability to focus and concentrate and not ruminate. It could be staying in your job. It could be getting the grades that you need to be able to keep moving forward with your schooling. What gets us there, which we think of as really the core trauma work, is regulation. Doing the explicit and subtle and direct and sometimes indirect work on getting regulation going more consistently, day to day, hour to hour, minute to minute. We think of it as this is the treatment level. This is where all the amazing creative work is going on on the program side, from talk interventions to things built around direct skills for breathing, for example, or indirect skills to music, to art, to sport. Like all these mediums create this opportunity to work on regulation. We'll come back to this more, but at its core, we find that most effective interventions, even ones that are an evidence-based practice or coming from kind of a clinical source, they tend to work on 1, 2, 3, or all 4 of these elements, which is connection, control, competency, and contribution. We'll come back to these in the second part of this session. But what we found is that any good approach, whether it's bottom up or top down, is integrating and using one or more of these. And we have to remember that in a community program working with kids, participation is the foundation. So first, that means showing up, and showing up long enough and regularly that this intended dose that you plan for actually occurs. And with that, showing up is critical, but hopefully then getting some interest and some engagement. From a program perspective, I think we all know that children and teens, they vote with their feet. Even in something that's required in a residential facility, it's still about participation. If they don't show up and engage, the time spent may not actually equal a real dose that you're trying to achieve. And for any parent or caregiver right now trying to get their child or their teen to wear a mask outdoors and is facing resistance, I think you understand the challenges that many youth workers face day to day with participation and engagement. So this is the journey that we go on. For me, it's the roadmap that shapes whatever we're doing in terms of activities, schedule, staff skill building, even measurement. It's a practical theory of change for how we try to achieve outcomes in a dynamic and complicated community-facing program. So what I want to share is what we've seen tends to form a set of pillars of a really strong trauma-informed program. It aligns with what we know is necessary for a program to be safe, mitigate against re-traumatization, and actually achieve some level of outcomes. The trauma-sensitive schools movement is a major source for some of these principles, and others are drawn from both the research that we've been able to do and work in the field. By no means is it complete. There's always things that we're adding and adjusting and tweaking as we continue to learn. But I think it's a good foundation for thinking about what we could be doing for building out a strong trauma-informed program. Truthfully, there's not time in this session to go into all these in detail, so I'm going to offer them to look at. You'll get all this content as a resource afterwards. But for consideration in reference to the programs that you might be running or thinking about running that were happening pre-pandemic and are now being reinvented and redesigned now. I'll put all these up there to look at. So the first is the ecosystem. And this is everything that surrounds your program. At a minimum, it's understanding that beneficiaries in a community-based program are never just your participants. They're also your staff, their parents and caregivers. There are lots of other people in the community. Always knowing that you're part of a whole, that there are other things happening in communities. You're not the only intervention, and there are many informal things that support good healing work. There's always a history, the history of the community, but also the history of that community in relation to working with programs like yours. And then there's context, sort of knowing what happens the other 22 hours of the day that they're not in your program. At the staff level, top-down leadership support, and not just buy-in, but active support is essential. There is a core skill set that staff have to have that's not just being trauma-informed. It's about their own ability to care for self, to make sure they can handle this harder work. It's also how well they collaborate and team with each other to do the work that needs to be done. There's always an issue of continuity in every program, and in particular in community-based programs, figuring out how we handle the turnover that's going to happen, who we hire in the community and externally, and how we support them economically to be sure that this work is something that's sustainable for them. And then there's capacity building, which is both training and ongoing support to help staff. There are many kinds of program elements. There's a number that we've listed here that for us are pretty critical, from what it means to build a safety in the experience that is both physical and emotional and also represents kind of people, program, and place. Knowing that healing work is both long-term, generally, it doesn't happen in short duration, generally, especially in a community context, and that it has to be developmental. Every person is going to be reacting and adapting their own way and growing, and some people need a longer time in the program to be able to succeed. There's structure that creates that predictability and consistency, building a strong program culture, making sure that what you teach in the program has relevancy outside of it, how explicit we are in talking about the work we're doing on trauma and resilience, where we engage kids in their own understanding and education of this work, what we measure and how we monitor to ensure efficacy, and then recognizing and really being excited about the elements inside your program that have that sort of natural therapeutic benefit. I want to highlight one piece briefly, because I think it's particularly resonant and relevant right now in the pandemic. One of my greatest fears is that the energy being exerted right now by direct service staff and program directors and program leadership to keep things going and to be there for your kids, it's finite, and it's not a sustainable long-term experience. And I worry that just when we get back to some form of programming that's in person to a degree, and might be this kind of hybrid of in-person and virtual, that our kids are going to be showing up not just with this excitement and need to get back to program, but with all this potentially trauma, but a lot of mental health challenges and needs. And that just when that happens, all of us, the staff, we're going to hit the wall and burn out. We saw this firsthand in Gaza, that this kind of idea of surge capacity, this ability to amp up your energy in the midst of a crisis and give more just when it's needed, is incredible, but the more can't last. And what we find is that staff need to be a bit further down the road of their own healing, and that in a situation where staff are also going through the experience, which for us is the pandemic, as well as your kids, that you have to be sure that there's some buffers in place programmatically to support staff. And I would encourage all programs, as much as we are doing everything we can for our children and families, to be sure that we're also giving that extra bit of attention to staff as well. It's needed now more than ever. So this is a lot. And I hope you're running a little bit of a quick checklist in your head to sort of see which ones you have in place, which ones you feel like you've got some traction with, and where maybe there's some things missing that we could be using, especially right now as we're reimagining the programming we're offering. Ideally, you have them all, but from a community perspective, we're working in context and it's complicated. We may not have them all, but we need to make sure we have the ones that are most important to us. Some is better than none. And we have to confront the limitations and still try to make a difference. In Gaza, we didn't have all of these the first year, and we didn't have all of these the last year, but we had enough for the program to become a buffer. And over time, we built more and more in. I imagine that many of you right now are thinking about pressing needs for the children and teens that you work with, and are innovating in incredible ways and making do with what can seem like impossible realities. And you're functioning in a world right now without facility or space, and trying to do your work without the same mechanisms and means you had a few months ago. Programs are reinventing themselves in radical ways, and as much as we're trying to sort out how to run program, I want to propose a slightly different way to look at what you're doing. First, for the vast majority of organizations, you're running something that is program. It may not feel like what it was, but it's still programming. Even informal connections with kids, that was there in your program before, that still counts. And every day we're confronting what we weren't, what we aren't anymore, and that's heartbreaking. But you're also doing your version of the imperfect solution to a very complex and what seems like an impossible reality. And that is something. In fact, it's even more given the odds that you're up against. So what I want to do is dedicate the rest of this session that we have to looking deep inside whatever programming you're doing and see if we can work together to maximize its impact. And putting all these design principles aside for a second. So go back to them, checklist, and do the work to see if we can build more in. But let's confront the reality that a lot of these are hard to get to in this current context, and we still want to have the most healing impact that we can and be a buffer for our children and adolescents we work with. And let's try to ensure that whatever you're doing, tutoring, study breaks, soccer drills over Zoom, art projects, and even huddles and cabin chats, that they're as powerful as they can be in terms of serving your populations. And hopefully, again, as that buffer against potential trauma, but also that positive thing that kind of keeps people moving forward and serves as an agent for healing that we want it to be. So if in our pathway to healing, the place where we have the most leverage and the most impact is that second rung, that second step, which is around regulation, then what we're talking about is dialing in deeply to what your brain wants. And a brain at its core, it wants to be emotionally regulated. It's begging for it. And what that means, and this is not a comprehensive list, but it means threat reduction, feeling safe, heart rate and breathing to a little bit slower pace, less knee-jerk reactions, less bad stress hormones, more good stress hormones, less rumination, the ability to focus, the ability to solve problems. For this context, in community-based programming, right, remember, lack of access to definitive clinical care, limited resources, lay staff. So as much as we may want to fully adopt a treatment modality at its whole, we probably can't. In Gaza, we had a psychosocial worker at each site. We had 8 of them. It was incredible. But it was still not the definitive clinical care model. We had 100 kids coming through every week. And seeing those kids meant seeing their families, which meant seeing parents and caregivers. There were multiple generations in households. And family size in Gaza was large. It was still very much the 160 mentors who were not formally trained as psychosocial workers, and some of them had teaching experience in education, that were doing the vast majority of this implementation work. So again, back to that pathway to healing, if you look at what is really working across many different interventions, what's happening in a well-run program is we observe those 4 things. That there's focus on connection, which is to feel cared for, to make friends, to be known, and that creates a kind of protection and safety. There's focus on creating opportunities for every person in the program to feel more in control of something, of self, of their experience, of the schedule. And when you do that, there's choices involved, and that fosters agency. To be able to feel competent, which another word is skills. And when you feel skillful in something, even one thing, right, that gives you efficacy. And to help, right, contribution. To do something for someone or the entity itself or the community. To serve, to be useful, which fosters meaning. and purpose and empathy. These 4 elements encompass something I think very special. It's this intimate and personal experience your participants need to be having every day, every hour, every minute that they're with you. And if they're wrapped up in all the trauma-informed design principles we looked at earlier, then you set the stage. But the full healing experience, I think, for its greatest potential, activates when we infuse everything we can with a combination of these 4 elements. Our activities, our conversations, how we think about time. And each of these elements on their own may be just what one of your kids needs to get a little bit more regulated. We know that one relationship can make all the difference. One choice can have a huge impact. One skill could be that buffer. And that skill could be breathing, but it could also be throwing a Frisbee. And that one chance to help can reset someone's perspective. And when you start to think deeply about the power of each of these elements, you begin to see a different potential set of outcomes that you can achieve in your program, in whatever form it's taking shape right now. Whether you're wrapping up kind of spring season of whatever that is to you, you're thinking about summer programming, you're planning for the fall. So let's unpack this a little bit and look at some examples. This is a deeper version of the 4 C's. I'm going to leave this up. I'm not going to speak to everything that's here. You can read some of it while we share some examples in dialogue. From a design perspective, these elements filter through all the layers of what we're doing. And it reshapes how you think about what you're offering. It should provoke creativity and thinking about sort of moments and experiences that could benefit your participants in finding more regulation. So let's start with connection. I'm a huge proponent of name tags. I know they're annoying. I know if they get wet in the rain and fall off, but most programs, very few programs retain the same population the entire time. Kids are coming and going, whether it's a summer day camp where each week it's a different set of kids joining, or a Boys and Girls Club setting where kids come and go every day. But to settle in and start to feel like you can make friends is to know names. And if your kids are coming and going, and our staff need that as well, let's put name tags on everyone. It seems so basic, but it matters. And if we're meeting people new every time, the introductions always matter. We've seen experiences where kids can be in a program an entire season, and they're playing alongside other kids, but they're not actually getting to know them, and the name becomes a barrier. And the same thing for staff. From another example of connection, in Ethiopia, we spent 2 summers working with the Worldwide Orphans Foundation, and they were running schools for kids from a number of orphanages around Addis Ababa, and they had helped. They invited us to be part of a team that was building a summer program, a day camp, to help bridge the school year. And the second year we had about 100 6 to 8-year-olds, and they would have a great day with all the staff. And the staff were all, for the most, well, a fair number of them were from the same kind of orphanages that these kids were growing up in. And we wanted to be sure that at the end of each day, every kid knew that connection they had that day was not just important, but was something that they should take with them. And it should be the last thing they experience. And so we had these huge closing circles, 20, 25 staff, 100 kids singing, cheering, announcements, and then we had every staff member just take a knee. Remember, they're 6 to 8-year-olds, and open up their arms. And the kids knew that they had 5 minutes to run around and say their goodbyes to every staff member they wanted to. They could high five, they could hug, they could cheer, they could say thank you. It was a connection festival, and that was the last thing that they got to do before they got in the bus. And whatever they confronted back at the orphanage, whether it was a strong and well-run program or not, they had that to take with them. From the choice side, you're playing a competitive sport like basketball, and some of your kids overheat emotionally when the game gets intense. Why wouldn't we give them more timeouts? The timeout in sport is one of the greatest regulation tools you have, but it's coveted and often reserved for the coach. Or a player can call it if they're told by the coach to call it. But why wouldn't we try to give that timeout power to the athletes themselves to call timeout when they needed to for whatever reason? And we've seen this work in leagues. People don't call 100 timeouts, they want to play. But to stop a game and reset, to take that with you in your life, to know you have that power is incredible. And back to our summer program in Ethiopia, every day we wanted every child, we didn't know what their experience was overnight, but to be someone who knows that they're growing up in a community where there aren't the parents that gave birth to them, can feel like a kind of out of control experience for some kids. And we wanted every day for them to know that they could start their day with a choice that was reminding them that they were in charge and that they had a chance to kind of control some of their experience. And so they would arrive, we greet them, we put their bags down, and then we set up 8 or 10 stations around the open space we had. And there was kicking a soccer ball, there was shooting a basketball, there was drawing, there was reading, there was music playing for dancing, and go where you want to go. It's your choice. And a lot of programs start with free play, but I think we don't always realize how important that is and what message it sends to start your experience with choice making at the beginning of every day. On the competence side, you may have a young person that wants to draw in an art class the same thing over and over and over again, or in a Boys and Girls Club play table tennis all day and nothing else. It's nice to mix up the opportunities for sure, but maybe we should let them do that. If that's what it takes for them to get some control back and to feel skillful, and in that process of doing the same thing over and over again, we get rhythm and repetition and pattern making, which is so good for the brain. Deep dives into something become immersive. They help with focus and attention. They occupy the mind in meaningful ways. And you may ask, don't you get sick of the same thing? But if the answer is no, let them focus on competence. And then finally, contribution. There's a reason why I think the work wheel, for example, is so effective for many kids in a camp setting or even a home setting. But why not extend it to have other opportunities to contribute, whether it's doing something nice for someone in the family or helping out someone in the community. I think we're working so hard to protect children right now, as we should. They need us to do that, but they also need to help and to offer something that can make a difference in the midst of an experience that feels very challenging. Early on in the pandemic, at least in North America's perspective, when people were first getting really paying attention to this mid to late March, I remember there was a story that sort of made the rounds in social media about a 13-year-old boy in Canada who was seeing that all these healthcare workers were experiencing all this pain in their ears and their heads from wearing face masks that wrapped around their ears, and he invented with this 3D printer he had this little plastic device that you could sort of just put over the back of your head that held the masks off your ears. He shared it on social media. He shared the prints for it, sort of how to make it on the 3D printer. It caught fire in Canada, and thousands of these got made in a couple of days, I think. And you got to believe that for that 13-year-old boy, he's having a lot of the challenges that many people face in terms of their outlook on the pandemic and how it's affecting him maybe negatively. But he also has a story of contribution, that he was able to do something that mattered to a global pandemic. That is going to serve as a buffer for him. That's why contribution is one of our 4 C's. And as we look at what we can do or imagine, in a program we're creating, you can start to see how these elements combine for power. So you don't have to think about them independently. We can be activity driven first. And one of my favorite examples is knitting. Knitting to me is one of the most kind of inherently trauma-informed activities you could ever do. There's sitting with other people and connecting, the classic knitting circle. There's choice in terms of pattern and pace and what you're working on and kinds of yarn you're going to use. There's competence, again, repetition, rhythm, patterns. And then there's contribution, which is helping someone else, teaching them, making something for someone else. Anyone who has had an opportunity to knit something for someone else, it's a wonderful gift to do that. It feels good to give something to someone else. And I have to give a shout out to my mom, Ellie Mallett. She has built what I think of as one of the best and most unknown trauma-informed programs running right now in the Cleveland Public Library, which is doing just that. It's knitting mostly for moms and also for children. Once this is on your brain, you see opportunities for healing in everything you're doing. I was playing Zoom bingo a few weeks ago with some kids that we work with at a summer camp program that is run out of Boston Children's Hospital. And regular bingo, calling numbers. Kids are, marking the cards they made in their homes. And we had these imaginary prizes that we were giving out. And so I'd have a little toy plane, and that was a free trip somewhere, and a toy car was a car they could drive around for life, and just having some fun. And I had this bag of sugar that I gave away, and I said, congratulations, you won because you're so sweet. But the rule for us was that if you've won once, you have to gift your second win to somebody else. So this teen boy won it, and he said, without hesitation, he called out one of his buddies of a similar age and said, dude, that's for you. 5 minutes later, he won again, and we had a pillow that said, love is all you need on it. And I said, congratulations, you won the love. But who do you want to give the love to? And he called out another one of his friends and said, dude, this love's for you. It's beautiful. It's a little bit of tweak to what we do that creates this opportunity for what? In that case, contribution. A trauma-informed program looks closely at the 4 C's and makes every part of its approach a bit more intentional. From staff interactions and their potential as healing moments, to digging deep into your existing activities, to tweaking them where you can, to using the language of connection and competence, or skills and friendships with your kids to help them see why they need it and how important it is. So think about your medium. I hope you are right now, and your activities. What's inherently safe, supportive, healing, therapeutic? How are you already facilitating 1, 2, 3, or all 4 of these regulation opportunities? And what else could you do? Are there certain kids that need a bit more of something? And how could you adjust the experience for them as well? And take that question back to your team and dig a little bit deeper. You'll be amazed at what is there. So I want to offer a deeper example to illustrate this, and I'll use this to start to bring the session towards closure. I don't have any photos to share because I can't even track down these kids anymore. This happened over 20 years ago, and B, this was the mid-90s, and I would prefer not to show the haircut I had back then either. But it's also before I had any real understanding of trauma, and before this framework even, really before Edgework. But looking back, it's become something that's just helped me make a lot of sense of what we do. In January of 1996, I pulled my car into a snow-covered parking lot alongside the Pecos River in the Santa Fe National Forest, about to start a job halfway through a school year at a residential school, an old summer camp that had been converted to this school for adolescents with all kinds of real significant learning challenges and then behavioral challenges as well. I was a co-lead for the oldest boys' cabin, which were 16 to 19-year-olds. It was literally a cabin. So a picture, a long one-story cabin. On one end was a big open room where all the kids lived. I had 6 or 7 of them. On the other end was living space, kind of a living room and open area. And then there were 2 hallways that connected with the staff quarters and bathrooms in between. It was a 3.5 day on, 3.5 day off shift, living in the cabin with the kids. I worked the weekend shift, so Thursday night to Monday morning. I was a co-lead there, so my colleague and I split those shifts, and we got to know each other pretty well. My kids ruled the school, but in also many ways they were ruled by it. We had this pretty intense behavior modification system that manifested as a massive chart of points that each kid could earn every day, summed up at the end of every week. It hung on the inside of our cabin door for everyone to see, and that determined their status, and then resulting privileges for the next day and really the next week as well. I think it was a 0 to 4 system for levels, 0 being kind of the lowest, 4 being kind of the most opportunities. Needless to say, my kids generally hovered around level 0, which roughly meant no unsupervised activity, no visitation, no visitors, no nothing other than the formal activities in the program for the weekend. Needless to say, motivation was not high in my cabin. So participation was truly a huge hurdle to overcome. I could get them to attend, but active interest and engagement was an Olympic effort. I was also trapped in a system where my kids needed some things that I just couldn't provide. So case in point, I had one of the kids in my cabin love to whittle and to carve, which is an amazing activity when you're in a forest with all this dead wood. Time well spent, creativity, skill building, control. It was amazing, but I couldn't do it because every time any package arrived, the staff opened it, and anything dangerous was removed and not given to them until they graduated. And this was a constant point of tension between him and the school, which meant between him and I. So the result, more level 0. So I made this choice. I decided to keep a little electric saw that was sent to him from his parents. And thus began a truly covert, administration-defying mission. I let him and the rest of the cabin use it to carve and to whittle. And it kind of worked. They were making small figures. They were carving words into sticks. They were occupied. They were hanging out together without incidents. And there was actual interest and engagement. And it lasted like several hours over the weekend. And then they, of course, went down an unexpected road. They started to whittle little guns. It seemed questionable for sure, but also harmless. And then this other kid in the cabin was kind of sciencey and crafty. He figured out that you could attach these wooden clothespins to the guns. And if you had a rubber band, you could then kind of stretch the rubber band from the front of the gun to the clothespin and create a rubber band gun. So I, of course, had to become the broker of these resources, which meant I actually was taking them from the school. And we had some pretty amazing and accurate guns. We had pistols and rifles, 2 shooters and six shooters. Within a few weeks, we had actually built a small armory. And I was literally funneling office supplies to them to craft their weapons, all unbeknownst to school leadership. The activity itself started taking up more of the weekend experience. Remember, besides meals and mandatory activities, most of my kids had nowhere to go and nothing to do. So the next obvious step was target practice. I'm not a gun person per se, but it was fun to take aim at an empty can and knock it down. It was actually a wonderful activity. And then, of course, they went down another unexpected road. They started shooting each other. And if you're imagining where this story could go next and you're thinking full-on team warfare, you would be correct. What eventually was created was a complex system of warplay. 2 teams, attackers and defenders. Attackers stood on the porch for 2 minutes while the defenders reset the cabin space for assault. This usually entailed rearranging furniture. They literally were dismantling their beds and moving couches to make obstacles and things to navigate through. We monitored for fire hazards, but otherwise anything went. Each person was allowed 2 weapons, unlimited rubber bands, had to wear ski goggles or some other protective eyewear. This whole thing was somewhat sketchy, but I was adamant about some basic levels of safety. There were head safety also, so if you got shot in the head, it didn't count, but any other part of the body was a hit. And if you got hit, you had to leave the cabin and stand on the porch for 60 seconds. If all of your team got hit in that same minute, then the game was over and the other team won. There was no physical contact, and any disagreements about a hit, and all the lights went on in the cabin, and we had to engage in a very intense and usually rapid negotiation to get to resolution. And if we couldn't resolve it, then the game ended. We either reset or that was it for the night. Yeah, and we played mostly at night. Remember, this is the weekend, not much else to do in the Santa Fe National Forest, and my kids, teenagers, were not going to bed after activities ended at 9 p.m. I can't lie, it was incredible. It was fun, it was intense, it broke up the brutal monotony of the weekend, and it actually became the thing that we all looked forward to. And then something remarkable started happening. There was energy and buzz in the cabin. We had something to talk about that was engaging. There was planning and strategizing for the next round. There was sweating and rigorous physical activity. And I had several obese kids. They were sleeping better. There were amazing moments of teamwork and collaboration, as well as all this practice negotiating and resolving conflict. They also started engaging more in school, finding ways to hold the points they were earning and not lose them. They were earning new points. There was some self-regulation. I actually saw kids coaching each other off of the brink of outbursts to make sure that that kid didn't lose points and drop a level. There emerged this will to self-regulate, so as not to put this special time in jeopardy. They even conspired to achieve level 2 status out of the 0 to 4 levels collectively, so as to be able to invite friends from other cabins to play. Yes, they conspired against the system to achieve a higher level of daily functioning. This flip dynamic made possible really by one simple omission, which is I didn't tell anybody in administration for a long time what was going on. But my co-leader and I talked about it regularly. How do you feel about this? We felt okay generally, and by principle, it was, we were working around just physical safety for the most part. We knew we could mitigate the rest. And honestly, the outcomes outpaced the concerns. We began to work in concert supporting messaging about the activity during the week to help manage sort of school time and behavior. He even came off shift once on the weekend to play with us. And they hosted. Friends came over to play. They felt so proud to share this game with their friends. Then about a month in, we went to the nurse one Saturday for what had been kind of the norm, which was the weekly weigh-in. And she pulled me aside and said, with a little bit of shock in her tone, that every kid in my cabin had a significant decrease in weight. They all had some weight loss. So she asked how this happened. It was shocking. My response, the weather's getting nice, it's getting warmer, I think they're doing better in school, we're trying to play some kickball. What am I supposed to say? We've opened up a small weapons facility and are basically playing the pre-digital version of Fortnite or Call of Duty. Or we're doing simulation military boot camp at midnight on Friday and Saturday. Neither of those would have gone over very well. Looking back, we had created a set of activities that actually fostered a healing pathway in a really complicated reality. As a case study, you could map all these elements back to the 4 C's. Right? Everything that goes into creating something. The structure of the game, the playing of the game, and the playing of the game over time. This game evolved. We got better at it. There were more coordinated strategies. We went back to it again and again and again. And within that game was so much connection. Every time we played, we made different teams. And so all these kids, and I had kids who didn't get along with each other in the cabin sometimes. They had to work together and be a team. It became them against other people, not them against each other. There were so many opportunities for control and power, and for someone who feels so disempowered. And these were kids who had, my kids, remember, 16 to 19, they were carrying with them throughout most of their childhood and into their adolescence these labels of their learning disability. Of the behaviors and the things they had done that had resulted in them landing in this school. The labels became their identity, and we were cracking at that. They were also working on some really intense regulation skills through conflict mitigation and mediating each other. And then the most important stuff, this ripple effect out to other parts of their lives, yeah. A little bit more energy, more focus, a bit more participation in classes, and just generally walking a little taller on campus, and not through an inflated ego that is protecting them against the hardships they face, but an actual internal sense of efficacy, agency, protection, and meaning. They had vivid examples of behaviors that they had been told and reinforced too many times that they were not capable of exhibiting. Self-control, anger management, collaboration and teamwork, discipline, future focus. Their story of self was actually being rewritten, and they had something fun to talk about and something really, really good to look forward to every week. To this day, it's some of the most important and best youth work I've ever done, and truly most proud of. Even more so now that I understand the elements that made it so. And I actually rarely share this story because it's so rogue. It does involve the manufacturing of weapons. And it's also it's not clean. We were working in a really complicated school system that wasn't high functioning. And I did make choices that went against administration policy. But I'll be very frank with you, controlling for all the variables is not realistic in most grassroots programs. It wasn't before the pandemic, and it certainly isn't now. The world is full of activities and opportunities that can heal. And I think we know this in ways we didn't know before. There's strong research now around yoga and dance and art, music, sports, knitting, singing, double dutch, and I think wood carving and simulated warplay. I'm not advocating for rubber band gun fights as the next trauma-informed activity, but we need to look in context. I believe we can work with what we have and what they have, not what they don't, and make amazing things happen, even in an era where now we must remain socially distant, or when we come back to being in person, we're going to have all these restrictions and challenges that we face. So take a daily functioning need and take what you have access to. Take the 4 C's and see what you can do. The need is tremendously great right now. And we have so many restrictions and limitations in our lives on top of the ones we had before the pandemic. But we have a lot. And all communities have assets. This is what I learned more than almost anywhere else in the work we did in Gaza. Partially because of the assumptions people make about Gaza and the stories that we hear about it. And partially because seeing the depth of what can be done with very limited resources. The UN conducted a survey in 2008, which helped us get funding for the Eye to the Future project that we launched the next year. And it found that of all the mothers that they surveyed, 100% reported symptoms in their kids of all ages of trauma and stress. And a CARE study that followed in 2009 found that 95% of the respondents, again, these were parents, mostly mothers, reported fear and signs of distress in their children, and behaviors like aggressiveness, bedwetting, sleeplessness were showing up in massive numbers. And they wanted to address this. They wanted to do some work to help reduce the bad stuff that was happening, right? That kids were experiencing and feeling and the resulting behaviors. But they didn't want to just have the bad stuff go away. They wanted to put something good in there as well. And for them, the answer across all 8 programs and communities we were in was school. It was grades. It's one of the only ways to have a better chance at employment there is to be sure that your grades stay good through high school and that you get a chance to study in university. So we looked closely at that. We said, great, we have a program, you want to do school, let's make it tutoring for the most part, but let's look at what's going on there. And the test pressure was so high for so many children. And that test pressure on top of this foundation level of, for many kids, trauma was too much. And so all the studying they did got erased on test day. So we gathered up a couple of hundred cheap plastic poker chips that we had and paper, and you can see in the picture here. And we invented a hybrid game that was somewhere between checkers and tic-tac-toe that was pretty complicated, but also you could learn quickly and then get better and better at. And we played every week for the 6-month program. And it was intended to simulate a testing climate. There was time pressures to some games. There were, of course, winners and losers. There was decision-making. And then after a few weeks, as kids got familiar with the game itself and got comfortable with it, we started changing the variables to increase the pressure and simulate some of the variables that can impact a child's ability to perform. So yes, we were doing window of tolerance stretching. We also taught them a simple set of steps to try to calm down in moments of indecisiveness or extra pressure, which literally was stop, breathe, ask questions, and then choose what to do. This was pretty much the entire formal part of the intervention that we did with them. And you know what? It worked. Distractibility and school anxiety generally went down. Kids coming out of our program had more enjoyment of learning. They felt like they could stay calm. There was more focusing in class. They were asking for help more often. There was feeling of self-efficacy that was higher. This was not perfect, Not everybody got to the highest level of what they could be, but their daily functioning got better. The biggest stressor began to improve, and that became an anchor for feeling better about other things. I'm not sure that what kids need right now is our entire program, even if we could offer it. There's so much else that they're facing right now. What they need is help navigating their biggest daily struggles. If we can figure out what those are and look for some that we might be able to impact, it may just be one part of your program, one piece of the interaction that you have. Less is not less right now, especially when it's put through the filter of how you can use the time you have to maximize connection, control, competency, and contribution. I have an 18-month-old daughter who, by my observation, is an adventurer. The word hike is already firmly fixed in her vocabulary, and almost every other day she asked us in the morning if she could hike. Before COVID-19, we went to the park often. Now we mostly walk around the block. And recently our route has shrunk even more. Not because of COVID-19 per se. Our daughter sits. She walks about 10 feet down the sidewalk outside of our house, and she sits down on a step or a ledge or a stoop of one of our neighbors. She looks up at me and says, "Papa, Papa," until I sit next to her. If my wife is there, she says, "Mama, Mama," and we sit with her for 5 seconds or 20 seconds or 10 minutes. When she's ready, she gets up, she travels another 10 feet, and she sits again, and the process repeats itself. Sometimes neighbors come out to say hi and wonder who's sitting on their steps. Sometimes they don't. We walk, we sit, we hang out. We probably cover about 80 feet on a good day. An hour later, we go back home. Call it what you want. I'm sure it's some part of a developmental stage for a toddler. But I also know that she's internalizing some of our stress. We are too anxious and don't have enough time to not have some of the intense conversations that we are having about the pandemic in front of her. But I also believe that she is asserting a series of choices, and she is seeking connection. It's what she needs right now, and if I can play my part in supporting a trauma-informed environment that lets her have it, then I am very content to travel 80 feet for an hour a day for as long as we need to, for her to feel that she has that level of control. Thank you for the opportunity to share with you some of our body of work. I wish everyone good health, good regulation, and good forward progress in your work with your young people, and with everyone else that you're working and caring for in your lives. Thank you very much.